The dungeon of despair, deep underground in a dark dungeon where the only light came from a few scattered torches, the atmosphere was oppressive. The air was damp and heavy, filled with a foul stench that made it difficult for the few inmates to breathe. The walls were cold and wet, the cells secured by heavy bars. Here, the worst experiments of the cruelest sort were conducted on the prisoners. Screams of pain echoed through the dark corridors, an endless symphony of suffering. In one of the cells sat a young goblin woman with greenish skin, lonely and desperate. She wept quietly, her shoulders trembling with each sob. Her name was Floni, and she had lost all her loved ones and all hope. Suddenly, the footsteps of a man echoed through the dungeon. It was the so-called alchemist, a man with a golden mask that hid his face and gave him an eerie aura. He stopped in front of Floni's cell and looked at her with disdain. "Why is this goblin woman still alive?" the alchemist asked coldly. He turned to one of his workers, who stood nervously beside him. "Haven't you found any pathogens yet that can eradicate all goblins?" The worker, a gaunt man with a pale face, trembled slightly as he answered. "Master, Floni is particularly resilient. It seems that some goblins have a strong immune system." The alchemist's face twisted into a wicked grin, hidden behind the mask. "Resilient? I see. If there's one thing I love, it's breaking the spirit of strong individuals. Continue your research. I want everything tried. From alchemy to diseases to dark magic, everything. Just find a way to eliminate these disgusting goblins." The worker nodded hastily and hurried away to carry out the cruel orders. At that moment, a messenger burst into the dungeon, out of breath and with a panicked look. "Master," the messenger cried, his voice trembling with excitement. "Viserna has been defeated. The dragon was killed by 2 giantesses, one of whom grew extremely large during the battle and simply crushed Viserna underfoot. The people are all in an uproar. The king is dead too, and the land is now without a government." The alchemist stared at the messenger in disbelief, his thoughts racing. Without another word, he turned and hurriedly left the dungeon to verify these new developments. Floni was left alone, her tears slowly drying. This news, strange as it was, gave her new hope. Were there still changes happening in the land? Even such incredible miracles, the idea that humans could become giants sparked a glimmer of hope in her. She longed to be a giant herself. Then she could break out of this cruel dungeon and take revenge on the wicked humans who had caused her and her people so much suffering. "If only I could become a giantess," Floni whispered to herself, her green eyes gleaming with determination. "Then I would show them what the wrath of a goblin looks like." A new beginning. Blake stood atop the highest tower of the castle, gazing out over her devastated kingdom. The castle lay partially in ruins, many buildings burnt to the ground. The tower itself was severely damaged, its top recently broken off by the giantess Nancy to save Blake from the evil dragon. Blake sighed. So many lives had been lost that day, and so much destruction had been wrought. Now it was time for rebuilding. She was grateful for the help Nancy and Eleven had provided, defeating the evil Lord Viserna once and for all. But now, the responsibility rested solely on Blake's shoulders. The land needed strong leadership, and Blake was determined to assume that role. She was now the new queen. In the hastily restored throne room, she gathered her advisors, lords, and generals. The atmosphere was tense, as there was much to discuss. "The rebuilding will be long and costly," Blake began, looking into the exhausted faces of those present. "Our supplies are low because Viserna set fire to all our storehouses. And only little could be saved. We urgently need building materials and food. Could we divert resources from the smaller towns and villages?" "Only from their surplus, of course. I don't want others to suffer," a lady of the court in a yellow dress spoke up. "I have already sent requests. In fact, some are willing to provide support. Moreover, I would suggest utilizing the giantess's footprints." Blake looked puzzled. How so?" "Well, the greater giantess has left very deep and enormous footprints in and around our city. These footprints are gradually filling with groundwater and rainwater. We believe that lakes will form here in the long term, which will secure our water supply. But not only that, the soil around these footprints is loosened and fertile. I would therefore recommend extensive farming in this region." Blake nodded in amazement. Those Those are good ideas. Make the necessary arrangements. The white-haired lady of the court nodded. Gladly, my queen. Many will surely join this project. Thanks to your heroic deeds, you have many loyal subjects and supporters all over the country. A general looked grim. Well, it isn't all support. Queen Blake Warg has also made many enemies. Another lord in a red cloak stepped forward hesitantly and raised his hand. In a hoarse voice, he asked, enemies? How do you mean exactly? The general sighed. Viserna was a tyrant, but he had a very large army. Many of his people remain loyal and try to uphold Viserna's policies. I'm sure some of them are already working on a plan to get rid of Blake Warg. No offense, Your Majesty. He looked apologetically at the Queen. Not at all, said Blake. I want to hear your honest opinions, and if you alert me to dangers, all the better. The general took a deep breath. Your Majesty, you are wise to think this way. And, if I may add, there are more problems. The neighboring kingdoms, especially Telania, have increased their military presence at our borders. This could indicate an imminent invasion. I suspect they sense our weakness because our troops and Viserna's forces have worn each other down. Blake swallowed nervously. Thank you, General. I will get back to you on this matter. I would appreciate a detailed report. A slick advisor stood up. Your Majesty. There is another issue. Since Viserna's fall, crime has increased. Everywhere in the land, there are disturbances. People are taking what they want, thinking there is no authority to hold them accountable. Blake nodded and ran a tired hand through her hair. We must remain vigilant and contain these dangers. But that is not all. There are also increasing tensions between humans and goblins. We cannot afford hostilities, especially not now. This was a topic that particularly annoyed Blake. Hostility between humans and other species. Why couldn't people just accept that there were different life forms with different traits and appreciate each other? Another advisor, Brunhilde, a woman in a green dress, interjected, the goblins are inferior demi-humans. They are just savages. You can't reason with them. I see little hope there. Probably the best thing would be to simply... What? Blake shouted angrily. What should we do? Get rid of demi-humans? Exterminate the goblins? Just because they are different? I never want to hear such brutal ideas ever again. My father had already worked to improve relations with the goblin tribes. And there were successes. So don't give me that rubbish. Blake sighed deeply. I had goblin friends as a child. To me, they are equals. We must find a way to overcome this intolerance. Our kingdom can only flourish again if we all work together. If we continue to weaken each other, it will be easy for our enemies to destroy us. Suddenly, a messenger stormed into the room. His face was marked by fear, and he panted as he spoke. Your Majesty, I bring urgent news. A village has been destroyed, and another is under attack. By a giantess. Blake jumped up, her eyes wide with shock. A giantess? Are you sure? But that can't be. The messenger nodded vigorously. Yes, Your Majesty. The survivors report a gigantic woman with greenish skin trampling everything in her path. The woman in the green dress laughed. Ha! If that doesn't sound like a savage goblin. Blake closed her eyes and took a deep breath. We must act immediately. Gather the troops. We cannot afford to lose more villages. And a giant goblin woman? I need to see this for myself. I will come and investigate this matter personally. Floni's revenge. 4 weeks, Floni had meditated in her cell. She wanted to use her mental strength to make her greatest dream come true. She had often heard that some humans possessed magic-like abilities. But even though everyone claimed that goblins could never learn such skills, she wanted to prove them wrong even more, and indeed, the moment she had longed for arrived. She managed it. She found a way to access her incredible mental abilities. Gradually, she learned to use her mental abilities to enlarge her body whenever she wanted while in her cell. She tested it repeatedly when she was alone, unnoticed, and then, one day, when she was sure it would work, she suddenly grew to 20 meters. And she continued to grow. The prison cell practically exploded around her body. The walls burst, the roof of the alchemist's building collapsed under her growing mass. With a triumphant cry, Floni rose from the rubble. The alchemist himself was not present, but his entire work lay in ruins. His workers and servants died. As a free giantess, now over 30 meters tall, she stood in the ruins of the building and saw for the first time where she was. It was a remote village on the edge of a forest. Apparently, it belonged to some independents or bandits. Floni was immediately attacked by bandits with swords, others shot arrows at her, but at her size, she hardly felt them. With mighty strides, she stomped towards the bandits and crushed them under her large green feet. The sound of bones and skulls crunching beneath her soles filled her with utter satisfaction. Finally, she had the power she had longed for. Finally, she could take revenge on the humans. Of course, the village wasn't just inhabited by bandits but also their families. Women and children, but Floni showed no mercy. She stomped and crushed them all. Her feet came down on one villager after another, turning them into gory remains left in her footprints. She also kicked the huts as hard as she could, causing them to explode into chunks and stones flying everywhere. When she heard a woman screaming. Without hesitation, Floni took a step to the side and stomped the woman into mush. At that moment, she felt a few burning arrows strike her shoulder. Normally, this would have been a problem, but not today. She turned and struck the wooden tower where two archers stood. The tower collapsed, and Floni stomped on the ruins to ensure the archers were thoroughly crushed. She moved from building to building, demolishing them and eliminating the remaining troops and villagers. She noticed that she was enjoying it more and more, the sensation of tiny humans being crushed under her feet giving her a unique thrill. Somehow, feeling the small, screaming people being flattened beneath her soles was simply perfect. When she had finished her rampage and in her rage destroyed everything, she stood in the middle of the utterly ruined village, looking with satisfaction at the squashed bodies of the people she had trampled. The feeling was magnificent, and she wanted more. This was just the beginning. From now on, Floni was on a mission to take revenge on the evil humans who had caused her and her people so much suffering. Her ultimate goal, to find the alchemist, and kill him. Until then, she targeted camps and villages of bandits who were using the current situation to terrorize the land and its inhabitants. With each step she took, the ground trembled, and the trees swayed like blades of grass from the tremors she caused. Her next target was a notorious bandit camp known for its cruelty. She had heard of this place many times, had even been near it sometimes, but her tribe had always avoided coming too close, knowing what would happen. A good target for a giantess like her. Full of anticipation, she set off. Dusk settled over the bandit camp as Grolak confronted his son, Tharn. They stood in the center of the camp, surrounded by huts and the watchful eyes of the other bandits. Tharn. Grolak's voice barked through the cool evening air. You must finally accept your responsibility. You will lead this tribe when I'm gone. Tradition demands it. And for that, you must train. Tharn, the 24-year-old son of the bearded chieftain, had his hands in his pockets, looking at his father with sad eyes. Father, I don't want to be a bandit. And I certainly don't want to be a leader. How many times do I have to explain? I want to paint, create art, leave something beautiful in this world. Grolak snorted contemptuously. Beauty? In this world, only strength matters. Art won't protect you when enemies come to cut your throat. Tharn shook his head. We only have enemies because of our actions. I can't lead this life any longer. I don't want it. I've caused enough harm in my past. It's a wonder fate hasn't already come for me. Before Grolak could respond, a massive tremor shook the ground. It felt as if a giant tree had fallen. But the tremors continued, and soon everyone realized they were footsteps. Mighty footsteps. The bandits looked around and soon saw a gigantic figure appear on the horizon. It was Floni, the green goblin giantess, approaching with thundering steps. Attack! Grolak bellowed, drawing his sword. Archers fired, and bandits trained in close combat rushed at Floni, but she was unfazed. With powerful strides, she crushed the attackers under her bare feet, the crunching of bones mingling with her triumphant laughter. Tharn stood still, mesmerized by the imposing size and beauty of the goblin woman. He had seen her before. No, actually he knew her well. He recognized her face now. It was Floni, the daughter of the chieftain of her tribe. The two had spent much time together as children, although Tharn had not been particularly kind. Their tribes were more or less neighbors, and although they coexisted peacefully, there had always been underlying hostility. Tharn had insulted, berated, and even physically struck Floni back then, which had been easy for him because she was not only a girl but as a goblin also much smaller than he was. And now? Her tribe had been wiped out, but she had not only survived, somehow, she had managed to become a giantess. Here she was, towering over everyone and practically invincible. Was this it? Was fate finally going to take its revenge on him? He stood still, motionless, watching as Floni destroyed the camp, trampling buildings and stomping bandits into the ground. His father, Grolak, fought desperately, but he too was eventually crushed under Floni's bare foot. With a loud crunch, his body broke beneath her. Tharn was shocked to see this, but he also knew his father had more than earned it after all the murders and raids in the past. After Floni had nearly destroyed the entire camp and crushed everyone, Tharn was the last one left standing. Floni looked at the young man who made no attempt to flee and recognized him. So there you are, Tharn. Not so mouthy now, are you? She raised her foot over him and spoke in a cold, booming voice. Your tribe ends today, just like mine once did. Prepare to die under my foot like an insect. Tharn looked up at her, his eyes full of admiration and acceptance. I am ready, he whispered, without any fear in his voice. Surprised by his reaction, Floni stepped on him slowly and with less brutality. She felt his body slowly give way under her soul, but she took her time crushing him. She hesitated. Was this really the right decision? Somehow, the young man seemed gentler than before. But that could also be deceiving. After all, he was a rogue and knew well how to fool others. Floni shook her head and decided to end his life here and now. For Tharn, everything happened in slow motion. He had looked up at her, fascinated and full of admiration. He was impressed and intrigued by her and wondered how she had managed to grow so large. The giant goblin woman was not just a destroyer, but also an embodiment of raw, untamed beauty. Her greenish skin glimmered in the light of the setting sun, her eyes sparkled with a mix of anger, determination, and pleasure, and her massive, muscular legs exuded unbridled power. As Floni stepped on him, Tharn felt this power against his own body. The sole of her foot was gigantic, rough, and yet in a certain way, majestic. He could see the fine lines and folds of her skin glistening in the sun for a brief moment before he felt them pressing down on him, and everything around him went dark. Tharn lay on the ground, feeling the powerful touch of her foot pressing down on him, gently compressing his body. The skin beneath her foot was warm and pulsating, like life itself. As the pressure gradually increased, he felt the immense strength she possessed. Every muscle, every tendon in her foot seemed to vibrate with energy, and he could feel the incredible power ready to crush him, but Floni was not yet ready to completely crush him. Tharn was, after all, the last survivor of the village, so she took her time. She lifted some of the weight off him and let her foot gently brush over him until his head emerged between her toes. Tharn was overwhelmed by emotions. Of course, he was afraid to die, but he also knew that he deserved death for his deeds. And then there was this incredible power and beauty that Floni exuded, the way she moved her foot over him driving him mad. He looked at her toes, between which he was trapped, intensely examining the pretty pattern of skin ridges, and he had to admit he was absolutely enchanted. You have really beautiful feet, Floni, he stammered awkwardly. Floni looked down at him with a mixture of contempt and delight. Thank you for the compliment. But you won't change my mind. I am still going to crush you. Better get ready. Floni slid her foot forward again, so the young man completely disappeared under her soft sole. The pressure on Tharn's body increased, slowly but steadily. But instead of feeling panic or fear, he felt a strange calm. He was no longer trapped in his predetermined life, he was no longer the son of a brutal leader. In this moment, he was simply a person accepting the inevitable. A young man under the beautiful foot of an enchanting giantess who had every right to be angry with him and was now fulfilling his fate. His last thoughts wandered to the images he had captured in his sketchbooks. He thought of the landscapes he wanted to paint, the artworks he would never create. And then he thought of Floni. In her, he saw not just a destroyer, but a kindred spirit. Someone, who like him, had been shaped and changed by the circumstances of the world. She had every right to crush him. The pressure continued to increase, and Tharn felt his bones give way under the weight. Pain shot through his body, but he remained calm. His final thoughts were gratitude for the beauty he had seen in the world, and for the strange, unexpected beauty he found in Floni. And that he had a pleasant death under her wonderful bare foot. With a final sigh, Tharn closed his eyes. The air was pressed out of his lungs, and his body completely gave in. The last thing he felt was the relentless, yet strangely gentle power of Floni's foot, which pushed him finally into the darkness, crush, and so ended the life of Tharn, who had wanted to become an artist, under the foot of the giantess who was taking her revenge on humanity. Floni felt the satisfying crunch beneath her soul. Her former tormentor was now history. Or rather, mush. She lifted her foot and looked at his flattened body lying in her footprint. He actually looks quite cute like this, she mused to herself. At least at the end of his life, he was briefly nice to me. She spent a while longer contemplating her perfect footprint, wondering what it had felt like for the young man to be crushed by her. How had it felt? Was it overwhelming? Did he truly find her feet beautiful? She looked at her feet and her soles. She had always thought her feet were pretty and loved decorating them with rings or anklets, but hearing it from someone else, especially from someone she was crushing, was a truly lovely compliment. Floni would never forget it. Suddenly, she felt her stomach growl. No wonder. As a captive, she had barely eaten, and now, as a giantess, she hadn't eaten at all. Floni had destroyed the entire camp but spared some farms and paddocks. Amid her rampage, she had seen several cows in the camp and intentionally left them unharmed. Now, she gathered some tent canvas from the ruined tents and fashioned a makeshift sack. With a deft movement, she captured several of the cows and placed them inside, saving them for later. One of the cows she skewered on a large, intact pole she had found among the wreckage of a demolished building. The cow let out a final shocked moo as it was impaled on the thick rod, then fell silent. With a few powerful kicks and blows, Floni shattered wooden beams and other flammable materials, retrieving them from the remnants of the camp. Soon, a large fire roared, casting a warm glow over the surroundings. She held the skewered cow over the flames, turning it slowly to ensure it cooked evenly. As the cow sizzled, Floni sat on the ground, gazing at her enormous feet still bearing the marks of battle. She felt a mixture of exhaustion and triumphant satisfaction. So, this is the power I've always sought, she thought. My feet are like weapons. Designed to crush. I can take what I want. No one can stop me. If only I had known about giants earlier and trained to become one myself. My whole life would have been different. My friends and family would still be alive. Once the cow was well cooked, Floni stood up and tore off a large piece of meat. She bit into it, savoring the explosion of flavors on her taste buds. It was delicious, and she felt strengthened and refreshed. With the skewered cow in hand, she set off. As she walked and ate, many thoughts ran through her mind. Have I done the right thing? She asked herself. These people have caused so much suffering to me and my kind. But am I now just like them? A monster that destroys and kills? Yet hadn't those two other giantesses done the same to defeat Viserna and his evil forces? Sometimes killing was necessary to prevent greater suffering. Right? She also remembered the pain and sorrow she had endured. No, I am not doing this just for myself, she reassured herself. I am doing this for all those who have been oppressed and tormented. I will change this world, even if it means becoming a monster. But then she smiled. She actually loved it to be a giant monster. With each step, the ground trembled beneath her feet. The trees shook as the giant goblin woman made her way. Floni bit into the cow again, relishing the sensation of power that surged through her. I am Colossus Floni, she thought proudly. And I will use my newfound size and strength. I will continue to crush and destroy, and it will be great. She continued her journey, the roasted cow in hand, seeking new targets to feel her wrath and power. But first, she needed a place to sleep, as it was getting dark. The night was her ally, and the stars above seemed to illuminate her path as she traveled on. In that moment, for the first time in a long while, she felt something like happiness. Yes. She was truly happy. What a marvelous feeling. Just before nightfall, and only a short while after Floni had set off, Blake arrived at the scene with her troops. The village lay in complete ruin, with all the bandits and residents crushed within enormous footprints. Although the prints were significantly smaller than those left by the other two giantesses who had previously visited their world, they were still formidable. The troops stared in horror at the chaos around them as Blake moved through the debris. Blake bent down and examined one of the footprints. "This is definitely the work of the giant goblin woman," she murmured thoughtfully, studying the shape and depth of the print. "She must be at least 30 meters tall." Her military advisor, an older man with a grim expression, stepped beside her. "Your Majesty, this was a massacre. Just like in the other village. No one should possess such extreme power, let alone abuse it." The advisor in the green dress, who had reluctantly agreed to accompany them, nodded vigorously. "Yes, Your Majesty. This is a threat to our kingdom. Such a creature must not roam free. As I've said before, these goblins are." Blake sighed and stood up. "Don't say it. I won't tolerate disdain against goblins. But I understand your concerns about this giantess. Let us not forget, though, that these were bandit villages. These people have terrorized and plundered our land. What the goblin giantess did is cruel, but it has also rid us of a danger." The general, who had been observing the destroyed huts with a grim face, turned to her. "Your Majesty, that may be true, but it doesn't justify the slaughter of innocent women and children. I might think differently if she had only killed the armed warriors, but look at this." He pointed to a footprint where a mother and her child lay, completely flattened and crushed. He had seen similar things in the other ruined village. Blake nodded slowly. "You are right. We cannot allow such acts to go unpunished. But we must also acknowledge the complexity of the situation. These bandits have caused immense suffering. And their families, particularly their wives, neither stopped them nor tried to dissuade them. So they bear some responsibility. Although I cannot say the same for the children. Nevertheless, I want to approach this matter impartially." As she spoke, she pulled a notebook from the debris. It was beautifully crafted, with pages filled with drawings of landscapes and mythical creatures. She read the signature, "For more beauty in the world, Tharn the artist." The artist likely hadn't survived. But a bandit who dreamed of a better world? That touched her deeply. She tucked the book away, intending to always cherish it. A younger advisor, a man she had come to value greatly, interjected. "Perhaps we should try to find this goblin woman and talk to her. Maybe we can understand why she acted this way and see if there's a way to prevent further attacks." The woman in the green dress snorted disdainfully. "Negotiate with a monster? That's absurd. She should simply be executed." Blake raised her hand to end the discussion. "Enough. We will consider all aspects of this situation. But one thing is certain, we must find a solution that ensures both justice and safety for our kingdom." She turned to the general. "I need suggestions." The general nodded. "As you command, Majesty. Let's summarize. This is the second destroyed bandit camp. The other one was about 20 miles north of here. Which means," Blake's eyes lit up as she finished the general's sentence, "which means she's targeting bandits specifically." The general nodded again. "It appears so. Both bandit tribes are known for their brutality and, if I may add, as henchmen for Viserna, especially for the most immoral deeds." Blake processed these statements while the general continued. "So it would be reasonable to assume that this goblin giantess will attack other bandit camps. We've already reviewed the maps of this area and identified the next camp. It's highly likely that this will be her next target." Blake nodded. "That makes sense. And I assume you want to set a trap for her, with your permission." "Yes," said the general succinctly, adding, "She expects to face some bandits, but not an entire troop of veteran soldiers. And certainly not that we have foreknowledge and will set traps. We will prepare ropes, harpoons, and large slings. I can have this organized with my men immediately. The darkness of the night will aid our surprise." Blake thought briefly and then said decisively, "A good plan. I will accompany you." The general looked at her in shock. "But no, my queen. That's far too risky. If my troops and I perish, it's unfortunate, but you are the new beacon of hope for our kingdom. You must stay alive." Blake shook her head. "No. This is too important. Besides, I'm used to fighting from my time as a rebel leader. My decision is final. I'm coming with you." The lady in the green dress raised her hand and nervously said, but surely you're not asking us to accompany you as well?" "I mean, the battlefield is not exactly a place for a lady like me." Blake nodded, annoyed. "You are free to leave. All those not militarily trained should go home now. I will handle this and return to the castle tomorrow." Most of the advisors seemed relieved to hear this and, after only brief preparations, began their journey home. Blake, her military advisor, and the troops, on the other hand, set off towards the next village. They did not contact the people there. Instead, they set up traps in the forest under the cover of darkness and lay in wait. The next day, as the sun peeked over the horizon and its first rays illuminated the village, chaos erupted. Suddenly, the rustling of trees signaled the approach of Floni, the giant goblin woman, who charged towards the camp with eyes blazing with fury and determination. With every step she took, the ground quaked, and the guards posted at the edge of the camp panicked. "What in the world is that?" One of the guards screamed, alerting the others, but they were just as bewildered as he was. By the time they called for the troops, it was already too late. With a mighty leap over the palisades, Floni landed in the middle of the camp and began destroying everything around her. Huts were flattened with a single stomp, and soldiers were tossed aside like toy figures or simply crushed underfoot. But then, the trap was sprung. Blake, the general, and their troops had been hiding in ambush. "Prepare yourselves," the general shouted, and the men and women in hiding took their positions. Tension hung thick in the air as Floni rampaged through the bandit camp. Then, it was time. Harpoons shot out from the forest, piercing the giantess's upper arms and penetrating her green skin. Floni screamed in pain and surprise as a huge net was thrown over her body. And numerous soldiers came out of their hiding and tried to pull her to the ground. Floni was strong enough to resist the soldiers pulling on the ropes, but then she was caught off guard again. Catapults hurled large stones at her, crashing down with thunderous force. Each impact brought excruciating pain. Blake watched the scene from a safe distance, her heart pounding with adrenaline, fear, and compassion. "Hold her down," she yelled. "But stop the bombardment. She's in great pain." Floni, tormented by the pain and the sheer number of her enemies, realized she was outmatched. But she would not give up. After being struck by several boulders and feeling her strength waning, she collapsed in the midst of the chaos, pretending to be dead. But in reality, she just closed her eyes to concentrate and began to meditate. She felt new energy growing within her, flooding her, making her stronger. It pulsed through her, and suddenly her body began to glow. Some of the surviving bandits approached in bewilderment, as did Blake's troops. The royal soldiers were about to use reinforced ropes to bind the giant goblin woman when she suddenly stood up with a mighty roar and began to grow rapidly. "What is happening now?" shouted one of the bandits, and the older general yelled in shock. "Quick! Open fire again. All catapults, fire at will." But Floni's body expanded swiftly, roaring as she ripped the harpoons from her skin and flung them aside. The soldiers retreated in terror as Floni grew to over 60 meters tall, freeing herself from the net. "No!" the general screamed. "Keep firing. Bring her down." But it was too late. Floni was already too large for the projectiles to have much effect. And she continued to grow, her rage and determination fueling her unmeasurable energy. She grew larger and larger, to over 100 meters tall, her feet now over 15 meters long. Grinning, the goblin woman looked down at the tiny bandits and soldiers around her. "Is that all you've got?" she shouted and began to stomp wildly. She trampled everything and everyone in her path. The soldiers had no chance against the gigantic goblin woman who now towered over them like a true colossus. One by one, they were flattened and crushed under the immense feet of the giantess. Blake stood paralyzed, unable to issue commands. Everything was happening too fast. The goblin giantess was furious, swift, And full of wild energy, with just a few kicks and blows, she had devastated everything around her. The palisade wall was destroyed, the bandits were all crushed, and even the royal troops were severely diminished. Finally, Blake roared, "Retreat! Quickly! Everyone, cease attack and retreat." Those who heard the order in time managed to save their lives. The others ended up as smears beneath Floni's feet. The general, however, did not back down. Determined to prove his loyalty and resolve, he continued to fight. He fired bolt after bolt from his crossbow, but the green giantess was hardly bothered. Annoyed, she raised her foot over the old man and simply stomped down. There was a sickening crunch beneath her sole, and the general was reduced to pulp under her foot. Blake was paralyzed with shock as she witnessed this. The general had always been a loyal servant to her family, and now he was dead? Smushed. Just like that, she gasped, overwhelmed, but pulled herself together and mounted her horse to flee. Before she could ride away, she was lifted into the air along with her horse. Floni had grabbed her with her enormous green fingers, plucking the horse away with her other hand and tossing the neighing animal into her bag with the cows she had collected earlier. Then she intensely looked at Blake with her large green eyes. "You're the princess, aren't you?" she said in a thunderous voice. "I must admit, you're quite brave, fighting alongside your soldiers and attacking me. Out of respect, I will let the rest of your men escape. But you will come with me." Blake, firmly held in the powerful, green fingers, shouted angrily, "I'm not the princess anymore. I am Queen Blake." Floni scratched her neck. "Oh, you got promoted? I must have missed that while I was being tortured in the dungeon. Well, mistakes happen. Anyway, I'll keep you as insurance, oh great queen of Zaya," she said with a mocking tone. With those words, the enormous Floni marched off with Blake as her captive, leaving the camp in ruins. Queen Blake didn't know what to think or feel. She was overwhelmed by the events and the resulting emotions. Some of her people were dead, including the general, whom she had almost considered a friend. The weight of responsibility and the consequences of her decisions weighed heavily on her shoulders. On the other hand, she was relieved that the goblin giantess hadn't been killed. She didn't want to worsen the situation between their two peoples. And the giantess seemed reasonable enough to let the fleeing troops live. So, it had to be possible to talk to her. At that moment, she also noticed that the grip of the giant fingers, though firm, wasn't so tight as to hurt her. Quite the opposite, the goblin giantess seemed to be trying to hold her gently to avoid causing pain, which was astonishing, given that she herself appeared to be in great pain. Which was no surprise, considering the harpoons had left large wounds in her arms and she had also been bombarded by catapults. As Floni stomped through the forest, her body towering over the treetops, Blake wondered if she should say something, but she didn't know what. It was hard to find words. But she had to say something. Somehow try to talk to the giantess. Appeal to her emotions. She made an attempt. "What are you planning to do now?" Blake asked timidly. The giantess glanced down at Blake briefly. "First, find a quiet place. I strongly suspect your troops will still try to kill me." "They had orders to capture you, not kill you," corrected Blake. "Oh really? Your harpoons and boulders told a different story. Since when does the royal family care about a few bandits? Or does it simply bother you that a goblin is doing your work? Is that a humiliation for you? Well, it won't be the last," retorted Floni. Blake tried to keep her anger in check and responded more calmly. "You can humiliate me if that's what you want. But be assured, I want nothing more than to end the conflict between our peoples. However, I must admit, even though I gave different orders, my troops will likely try to kill you now that you've captured me." "I figured as much," Floni said mockingly and continued stomping through the forest, searching for a suitable place. After several kilometers, she found a clearing. Here stood a solitary hut next to a waterfall that flowed into a small lake. The place was idyllic, secluded, and offered the peace she desperately needed. "This will do," she murmured and carefully set Blake down. "Try to escape, and I won't hesitate to crush you." Blake took the warning seriously and stayed put, watching as the giant goblin woman approached the waterfall. She bent down and drank greedily from the cool water. Then she used it to cleanse her wounds. Every contact of the water with her injuries made Floni wince in pain. Blake could see the agony in Floni's face, and despite everything that had happened. She felt sorry for the giantess. "Can I help you?" she asked hesitantly. Floni gave her a scornful look. "You? Help? That's ridiculous." "No, really," Blake insisted. "I have healing powers. Let me help you." Floni frowned, clearly unsure if she could trust Blake. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. "Try it. But if this is a trick, I'll squish you." Blake nodded. "No trick," she assured and stepped closer. "You'll have to lift me and bring me to the wounds. I need to touch them." Hesitantly, Floni lifted the small queen and held her near the wound on her left arm. Blake gently placed her hands on one of the wounds on Floni's arm and focused. A soft, warm glow emanated from her hands, and the wound began to slowly close. Floni watched in fascination as the flesh under Blake's touch started to heal. The pain subsided, and a hint of relief showed in her eyes. This really works," she murmured in surprise. How do you do it?" The young queen's mood brightened significantly. "It's a skill I inherited from my mother. And of course, I had to train for years to master it," she said as she healed the other wound on the goblin giantess's arm. Floni rolled her eyes. "Oh, so you think we goblins are too dumb to learn such skills?" Blake blushed. "What? No. That's not what I meant at all." "But that's what you thought," Floni snapped and set the small queen back on the ground while she leaned against the hill beside the waterfall. "I know how you humans think." She stretched out her legs and placed her enormous feet directly in front of Blake, so the little queen was staring right at her soles. The pungent smell of sweat made Blake cringe. She used another of her mental abilities to telekinetically redirect water from the waterfall and splash it onto Floni's feet. "You really should wash yourself. Your stench is almost unbearable." "Oh really? Do we goblins stink too much for your delicate noses? Want a real taste of it?" Playfully, Floni lowered her foot onto Blake and grabbed her with her toes. She clamped the little queen between her big and second toe and lifted her into the air. "How do you like that? Is the smell pleasant?" "No." "Haha." Blake wanted to hold her nose, but she couldn't move her arms, as they were too tightly pinched by the rough skin of the greenish toes. She was practically drenched in the foot sweat. "This is disgusting. Stop it," Blake shouted, frantic. But Floni only laughed. You'll have to get used to it, my dear. Because I'm a giantess now, and you humans will always be literally at my feet. That's your place. Even yours, Majesty." "Hey. Is this how you treat a queen?" Suddenly, an older woman emerged from the small hut next to Floni, puzzled by the loud noises and cries. "What's going on here? Can you please be quiet? I want to sleep." Floni noticed that the old woman was probably senile since she hadn't even realized there was an enormous giantess in front of her. Deciding to leave the old lady in peace, she promised with a crooked smile, "Sorry, we'll be quieter." As the lady returned to her hut, Floni leaned forward and examined Blake, still wedged between her toes. "Your human status symbols and ranks mean nothing to me," she declared. "For me, only power matters, and I have plenty of it now." Floni wanted to rest and pondered what to do with Blake. Finally, she decided to attach the little queen to her anklet. The spot seemed ideal since she wanted Blake to always be at her feet and unable to escape. With a firm grip, she secured Blake and watched with satisfaction as the little queen was now completely at her mercy. Blake couldn't believe what was happening to her as the goblin woman's enormous fingers chained her to the golden anklet. "What is this supposed to be?" she asked, utterly furious. "This is your place now," Floni said firmly. "Here you'll stay as long as I want. You are now my special foot ornament." Blake rubbed her eyes, realizing she had no chance and had to submit. She had to do whatever the goblin woman wanted. "Well, okay. I can accept that," she finally said. "After all, you do have beautiful feet. I consider it an honor to adorn your feet, but could you do me a small favor and just wash your feet a bit? Because you're right, our human noses are very sensitive." Floni stared intensely at the little queen. "Do you really think my feet are beautiful? Because you're the second person to tell me that." Blake nodded sincerely. "Yes, it's true. You have beautiful feet. They would be even more beautiful if they were a bit cleaner, ha. Floni burst into sudden laughter. You mean it? You actually like my feet? Then I've chosen the perfect place for you. What irony. Ha ha ha. Floni calmed down, lifted her foot over the lake, and slowly sank it into the water. All right. Because you admitted that honestly, I'll grant your wish, but you might get a bit wet too. Her foot submerged in the cool water, and Blake found herself in the water as well, as the foot went in up to the ankle. That doesn't bother me. It's refreshing. Blake swam a little in the water, which became slightly oily from the sweat and grime around her. Go on, have a drink, Floni said, grinning. Blake steeled herself and took a few sips, and it wasn't as bad as she had imagined. The water actually tasted quite normal, perhaps a bit salter than usual. Huh, that's good, my little one. I think you're starting to get used to your place. Blake took a deep breath as the giantess lifted her foot out of the water again. Hanging from the golden chain, she asked, if I'm to be your foot ornament, may I at least know your name? My name is Floni, she said proudly, stretching out her legs again and leaning back against the hill, to relax. Floni? That's a beautiful name. Pleased to meet you, but Floni simply closed her eyes and said, I want to rest now, and you should too. Later, I'll decide what to do with you. As Floni fell asleep, Blake hung from the anklet, contemplating her situation. Although she was securely bound to the giantess's anklet with ropes and dangled loosely beneath Floni's ankle, it didn't feel uncomfortable. Despite having no means of escape, she oddly didn't feel panicked. Instead, she observed the massive goblin woman, whose breaths had become slow and steady. Blake couldn't help but repeatedly gaze at Floni's enormous feet, especially the one she was hanging from. She felt the warm skin against her back. Noticed the now thankfully lighter foot odor, and was aware of every small movement the giantess made with her feet while she slept. For some reason, Blake found the giantess's feet very beautiful and could hardly look away. The greenish skin, the strong toes, and even the rough patches seemed almost hypnotic to her. It's really beautiful, she whispered to herself, feeling a strange sense of contentment. When she tore her eyes away from Floni's feet and looked up at her sleeping face, she noticed that the green giantess looked genuinely kind while asleep. The hard lines of her face had softened, and a peaceful expression rested on her features. Blake began to believe that seeking a peaceful resolution was the right path. She didn't regret healing her wounds. That had been the right thing to do, she just knew it, no matter what everyone else thought. The sun slowly made its way across the sky, and evening began to fall. Blake, still hanging from Floni's anklet, felt the weight of sleepiness pulling her down. Eventually, she closed her eyes and drifted into a restless sleep. As the shadows of the trees grew longer, the elderly woman emerged from the hut once more. She looked around cautiously before quietly making her way into the forest and disappearing among the trees. Blake and Floni slept deeply, exhausted from the day's arduous events. As dusk settled and the sun slowly dipped below the horizon, dark figures emerged at the edge of the clearing, unnoticed by either of them. Suddenly, one of the assassins drew his bow and aimed at Blake. An arrow whizzed through the air, but Floni, sensing the danger instinctively, pulled her leg up just in time, causing the arrow to miss its mark. Blake, feeling as though she was being flung into the air from the rapid movement, was immediately wide awake, just like Floni, who scanned the area, ready for combat. Floni quickly pulled her leg with Blake attached to it close to her and shielded the queen with her hand. Receiving several arrows herself, which barely bothered her. Hold on tight, princess. Floni called out as she stood and began to stomp towards the attackers. I'm not a princess anymore, I'm a queen. Blake tried to protest, but the stomping movements and the mighty strides of the giant goblin made it difficult for her to speak. Hanging from the chain, she was swung back and forth, rubbing against the greenish skin of Floni's foot. With playful ease, Floni crushed one attacker after another underfoot, while Blake, dangling from her anklet, witnessed everything up close. Blake was deeply impressed by Floni's size and strength, but especially by the playful way she moved her immensely huge feet and squashed the attackers beneath her with such an ease. And with such graceful, powerful movements, despite her limited mobility, Blake felt absolutely safe with Floni. Although arrows still flew through the air, due to Floni's rapid movements and the constant tremors caused by her steps, the enemies had no chance to aim properly. Not a single arrow hit its mark. Floni reveled in crushing the attackers beneath her bare soles. Her laughter echoed through the clearing as she playfully stomped down her enemies and squashed them into pulp. While Floni realized that stomping on tiny humans was her new favorite pastime, Blake couldn't help but admire the immense power and precision with which Floni operated. After nearly all the attackers were flattened, Floni grabbed the last remaining one, who had been hiding fearfully behind a tree trunk. But Floni had noticed him, to his misfortune, and snatched him up, ripping the entire tree from the ground in the process. As she held the masked man in her hand, another figure caught her eye. The older woman, cautiously heading towards her hut, once again pretending to be senile. Floni saw through the ruse this time. She was likely the one who had brought the attackers here. "For whom do you work?" Floni asked, her voice a deep rumble. "Is the alchemist behind this? Have you seen him? Do you know where he is?" The woman did not respond, staring straight ahead and pretending to not notice the giantess. "Do you really think I'll fall for your act again?" Floni asked angrily and, without further hesitation, simply stepped on her. The older woman let out one last short scream as the giant foot came down on her. A second later, she was crushed into a pulp beneath the massive sole with a loud crunch. Floni ground her foot back and forth to thoroughly smear the woman, as Blake protested loudly, "No. What are you doing? We need to get some information. You can't just kill everyone." Floni shrugged. "Do you really think you're in a position to give me orders? Look at you, hanging from my anklet. You're just decoration for my foot." Blake took a deep breath. The goblin woman was clearly very emotional, and although Blake herself was going through an emotional turmoil, given that there had just been an attempt on her life, she tried to keep herself together and speak as kindly as possible to Floni. "It's true. I'm tiny and just a toy to you, but these people tried to kill me. Not you. There's something behind this. We might have common enemies. And we should learn more about it. By the way, thank you for saving me. Without you, I'd be dead now." It was hard for her to admit, but the little human queen had made a good point. And she was more pleased with the praise than she cared to admit. "Sorry, you're right. But we still have this one," she finally said sheepishly, looking at the small masked man in her hand. She had intended to simply eat the guy, but she held back, squatted down, and unfastened Blake from her anklet. "You can question him," she said, pressing her thumb down on the man, breaking his arms in the process. Then she placed him in her open hand and set Blake beside him so she could interrogate him safely. Blake sighed in relief and approached the masked man. "Thank you, Floni. I owe you a great deal. Now let's question this guy. Maybe we'll find out who's behind this attack." Blake pulled the mask off the man's face. He had a dark complexion and light blonde hair that shone conspicuously in the evening's dim light. Somehow, he looked familiar, but she couldn't recall where she had seen him before. But it must have been in the castle or somewhere nearby because she remembered his face well. She had seen him often. "But where and with whom? I know you," she said confidently and threateningly. "Tell us everything. Who is behind the attack? Why did you want to kill me?" The man remained silent and defiantly looked away. Floni, who had been watching Blake closely, brought her gigantic face closer. She opened her huge mouth menacingly, showing her sharp teeth, and slowly, sensuously licked her lips with her tongue. The man trembled with fear as he looked into Floni's hungry eyes. He could barely hide his terror, but he still remained silent. "Talk, or I'll make short work of you," Floni growled and playfully licked over the man and Blake with her big tongue. Blake flinched as the rough surface of Floni's tongue licked over her, soaking her entire clothing with saliva. She felt disgusted and shocked. What if Floni had accidentally swallowed her? But as she reopened her eyes, she noticed how effective the demonstration was, as the man now quivered all over and was visibly in mortal fear. The fear drove him to such desperation that he began to speak hastily. I was hired by Brunhilde." Blake remembered the advisor in the green dress well. She was strongly opposed to the goblins but had otherwise said or done nothing suspicious. Confused, Blake asked, "Brunhilde? But why would she want to get rid of me?" The man stammered fearfully, She wanted it to look like the queen was killed by the goblin giantess to have a reason to go against the goblins. A false flag operation? Blake got goosebumps. All this just to fully unleash her hatred for goblins? Or was there more behind it? Is that all? Just for that? Blake asked angrily, her voice hoarse. The man shook his head. Besides, she's a traitor and has made a pact with the neighboring kingdom of Telanian, which is also interested in exterminating demi-humans. Blake was utterly perplexed and shocked. Traitors within her own ranks? Some of the advisors had already served under her father. Could it be that other advisors were traitors as well? Did she have to distrust everyone? She took a step back, trying to process the man's words. Brunhilde, my own advisor. She murmured incredulously. She betrayed me. Floni watched the young queen, sensing her confusion and pain. Well, that was not the information I was hoping for. But it explains a lot, I guess, she said in her booming voice. What do we do now, little queen? Blake looked into Floni's huge green eyes. So beautiful. When Floni wasn't looking furious, she was truly of enchanting beauty. Seeing her face up close, Blake could notice every uneven spot on her skin, every little wrinkle, but they were not flaws. It was all perfect as it was, simply beautiful. Especially the huge shimmering eyes. When she realized she had been staring at Floni for a long time, she shook herself and said, I'm not done yet. I need to know if there are more traitors. Angrily, she turned back to the man. He shook his head fearfully. But I know nothing more. I belong to Brunhilde's troops. I don't know of any other traitors. But I mean, don't you know? As a noble, you must always be cautious and have eyes in the back of your head. Especially as a queen, everyone knows that. Blake knew the man was right. She had approached the matter far too naively. She composed herself and lifted her head. We need to return to the castle. I must expose the traitors and prevent a war between our peoples. But first, we need to make sure this man can't get back to inform the others. Floni bent down a bit more, bringing her face so close that the two humans in her hand couldn't fully comprehend it anymore. Her eyes sparkled dangerously. Don't worry, she murmured with a crooked smile. I'll take care of it. She opened her enormous mouth and let her long, rough tongue slowly slide out. The man trembled with fear as he saw the wet tongue approaching him again, realizing what was about to happen. With a quick, deft flick of her tongue, Floni licked the man up and pulled him into her mouth. But her tongue was so large that she accidentally scooped up Blake as well. Blake screamed in terror as she suddenly found herself in the dark, wet cavern of Floni's mouth. The tongue was rough and warm, and she could feel the moist heat of the giantess's breath. Panicked, she tried to orient herself and find some sort of grip while being shoved around alongside the screaming man. Floni, immediately aware that she had also licked up Blake, paused. She could feel the slight wriggling of the queen on her tongue and knew she had to be careful. Yet the thought of playing with the two a bit brought a smirk to her face. She moved her tongue skillfully, pushing Blake and the man around, pressing them against her teeth and the roof of her mouth. Blake struggled desperately for air. She felt as if she were trapped in a living, pulsing cave. The taste of saliva and the warm, humid breath filled her senses. Every muscle in her body tensed as she tried to hold on to something. The tongue beneath her moved incessantly, seeming to tease her intentionally and drive her into the tight, wet darkness, but Floni had everything under control. She knew exactly what she was doing. With careful movements of her tongue, she eventually pushed Blake forward until the little queen landed on her lips. Blake gasped for air, her body trembling with adrenaline and relief. She was on the giantess's lip. Her heart pounded, and she didn't know how to feel. The lip was so smooth and soft and so fascinating. When Floni's hand appeared in front of her mouth, Blake climbed out and into the giantess's palm. All good, little queen? Floni asked with a mischievous grin. Without waiting for a response, she turned her attention back to the man in her mouth. He was pushed onto a row of her teeth by her tongue. And then, with a crunching sound, she bit down, crushing the frightened man between her powerful teeth and swallowing him as if he were nothing more than a little snack. Blake, still dazed from her brief but intense time in Floni's mouth, watched as the giantess bit down on the man and swallowed his remains. She could hardly believe what had just happened. Her heart raced, and she felt a mixture of relief and gratitude toward the massive goblin woman who had protected her. Even though she had put her in danger and humiliated her playfully, it seemed to be part of her personality. She was unpredictable. And somehow, Blake couldn't be angry. On the contrary, despite being drenched and lying in the greenish giantess's hand, she felt nothing but affection and admiration for Floni. Floni licked her lips and gave Blake a satisfied look. "Well, that was an adventure, wasn't it?" she said with a chuckle. "I hope you learned your lesson. With me, you're safe, as long as I want you to be." Blake was utterly speechless and simply nodded. She had no words for the feeling she was experiencing. Floni noticed how paralyzed the little queen was, scratched her neck, and asked, I hope it wasn't too bad." "Are you okay?" Blake nodded again and said this time, "Yes. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you." Floni had actually expected the queen to be angry. But apparently, that wasn't the case. Strange. Trying to end the awkward situation, she said, "Well, you're welcome. And, I'm still hungry, but I think we need to head to the castle. After all, you want to expose the traitors, right?" Blake shook herself. "Wait, you're still hungry? But, we can take a moment." She looked around and then back at the lake. Grinning, she said, "I have another trick up my sleeve. Sit by the lake, and I'll show you." Floni sat down, curious about what the little dark-skinned woman had in mind. Blake stood up in Floni's huge hand and made strange hand movements, focusing intently. Then, suddenly, a large fish jumped out of the water, landing right in Floni's hand. Then another, and another. The goblin woman was visibly surprised. She wanted to ask again how Blake did that, but she held back this time. The little human woman apparently had a few incredible tricks up her sleeve. She liked that about her. Are these for me?" Floni asked as enough fish filled her hand. Blake nodded and sat back down in the hand. "That's right. Enjoy them. You can have them all because I'm not hungry, are you sure? I love raw fish. And these look really good." Blake nodded shyly. "I just enjoy watching." Floni didn't hesitate and began devouring the fish. Blake watched, fascinated, as the giantess's powerful teeth effortlessly crushed the fish flesh. The sounds Floni made while chewing were intense and somehow soothing. A deep, contented hum filled the air as Floni swallowed the fish. Blake could see her throat moving as she enjoyed the meal. Blake felt tiny next to the massive Floni, but she deeply enjoyed it. She found everything about Floni beautiful and fascinating and couldn't get enough of her. The way the goblin woman used her tongue to maneuver the fish, the strength of her jaws crushing the meat, and the deep, satisfied sigh after each swallow, it was almost hypnotic. When Floni noticed Blake staring at her, she paused and asked, "What's wrong? Why are you staring at me like that?" Blake felt caught and blushed. It's just, I find you really fascinating, Floni. You're so strong and enormous, so wild and brave, and beautiful, and I really like you. I'd love to be friends with you. I mean, do you want to be friends? It would be an honor for me." Floni was utterly surprised by this outpouring of compliments. Confused, she replied, "A human who wants to be friends with a goblin? Especially a queen? That's unexpected." She set aside her prejudices for a moment and thought about Blake's words. She liked the little one too, but was still skeptical. "But why do you like me, even though I've treated you with such disdain? You've been kind to me, given me the fish, and healed my wounds, but I haven't been particularly nice." The young queen shrugged. "Usually, everyone treats me very formally and politely because I'm the ruler. But no one is like a friend to me. But you're different. I like that you treat me without respect. It's so natural and real. I don't find it bothersome at all. It's refreshing for me. And besides, you saved my life." Floni had to think about that. Then she said, "Okay, that's a fair point. In that case, I think we can be friends." Blake beamed. "Thank you, Floni. You have no idea how much that means to me." Floni extended a finger, and Blake grasped the huge fingertip with both hands, pressing herself gently against it and enjoying the sensation. It was an unusual handshake, but it was also an unusual friendship being forged. At that moment, both knew that this friendship would be something special, even though they had no idea how it would develop. Floni stood up again and looked at the little queen in her hand. This is truly a delightful turn of events. I always thought humans had only prejudices and negative feelings toward us goblins. But you're different. That makes me happy, Blake nodded. I'm not the only one. You'll see, there are others who think like me. Together, we can surely create a better future for our people. You could work with me, maybe we can even share the kingdom. Floni laughed. Slow down, little queen. I'm not interested in rulership or diplomacy. But I'll gladly support you if this is your vision for our land. Very well. Then let me take you back to your castle. Floni kept Blake securely in her hand as she moved through the night towards the castle. The stars glittered above them, and a cool breeze rustled quietly through the trees. Blake could feel the rhythmic steps of Floni, a soothing beat that helped her organize her thoughts. Despite her gigantic size, Floni moved with remarkable grace, which deeply impressed Blake. You know, Floni, Blake began thoughtfully, your humility and strength are extraordinary. I believe you would make an excellent ruler. Floni looked down at Blake, slightly annoyed. I already said, I'm not interested in that sort of thing. I'm more of a warrior, you know. Especially with my current size. I want to use that. Blake pondered these words. It was true, not utilizing Floni's strength would be a waste. But she had an idea. How about you take the position of my chief military advisor? You would command all the troops and fight alongside them. Someone like you would be an incredible asset. Floni took a deep breath. The thought of leading tiny soldiers against other tiny soldiers was somewhat amusing and appealing to her. But she shook her head. I don't know. What about your current general? Blake blushed slightly as she tried to put everything in order. Well, to be honest, you stepped on him yesterday. So his life ended in one of your footprints. Floni paused briefly and looked at Blake, embarrassed. Oh, so he was among the troops at the bandit village? I'm sorry about that. Blake nodded. Yes, he was a good man. I trusted him greatly. He continued to fight against you, even though he knew he had no chance. He was very loyal. Floni rubbed her forehead. Maybe I should be more careful about who I crush in the future. Blake nodded. I agree. That would probably be wise. Anyway, you are someone I absolutely trust. And I would love to have you by my side, especially in this role. Floni chuckled softly, her deep, rough tone vibrating through the air. A military advisor? Even though I just crushed your last advisor underfoot. I don't know how people will take that. Blake smiled. If the order comes from me, people will have to accept it. Floni considered Blake in her hand and nodded slowly. I'll think about it, little queen. A few minutes later, as they reached the city gate, Blake was relieved that it was so late and the streets were empty. The darkness concealed Floni's gigantic figure, and only a soft rumbling, caused by the giantess's gentle steps, could be heard as she crept through the narrow alleys. Blake marveled at how light-footed and careful Floni was despite her immense size. You are amazing, Floni, whispered Blake as they passed a sleeping animal tied to a fence, which didn't even twitch its ears. Floni grinned. Years of hiding and sneaking around pay off. Upon arriving at the castle, all the guards were immediately on alert as the enormous giantess approached. Some reached for their swords and bows, but Blake, who was in the giantess's hand, raised her voice. Let her pass. She is my guest and protector, she commanded firmly. The guards exchanged skeptical glances but naturally lowered their weapons and obediently stepped aside. The colossal Floni strode over the small guards and the wall, entering the castle courtyard. It felt to her as if she were walking through a miniature model of a castle. She set the queen down and watched as Blake walked away with some of her closest advisors and guards. Somehow, she didn't like the thought of Blake being alone somewhere in the castle. There were proven traitors in her midst, and she didn't know whom to trust. Floni felt uneasy that there was nothing she could do at the moment but wait. But such was the situation. So, she tried to calm herself and make the best of her time. And she was still tired. She found a comfortable spot against the wall and sat down. Her massive body leaned against the ancient masonry, and she closed her eyes, ready to find some sleep. Meanwhile, Blake was in the throne room, gathering her attendants and giving rapid orders. Find Brunhilde's people and arrest them. All of them. No one is to escape. We must ensure that there are no more traitors among us. As she gave her orders, Blake scrutinized the faces of all present for any telltale signs of treachery, but she saw nothing suspicious. The attendants bowed and hurried off to carry out the Queen's commands. That was somewhat reassuring, but also troubling. Blake had no idea if there were other traitors and whom she could still trust. One thing she knew, hard times lay ahead for her as queen. She returned to Floni and gazed at the enormous figure of the goblin woman, who was leaning against the courtyard walls, gently snoring. She watched the green giantess for a while, who looked so peaceful as she slept under the open starry sky. What a beautiful sight. Blake's situation was actually much better than before. Now she knew she had to be cautious, and she had found a new friend, one incredibly powerful at that. And she truly liked her from the bottom of her heart. Sleep well, Floni, she whispered softly before heading to her chambers, filled with new hopes and plans for a better future. The next morning, a tense atmosphere pervaded the castle. The kitchen maids, chamberlains, and stable masters paused in their tasks as news of an impending execution echoed through the courtyard. The city guards, who had begun their patrols at dawn, and the heralds, tasked with spreading the announcement, set off to convey the shocking news: an execution. At the marketplace in front of the castle, a herald shouted loudly through the city streets. The news spread quickly like wildfire, and the citizens flocked to witness this brutal event. In front of the castle, people gathered in dense rows around the marketplace. Brunhilde and her closest advisors and followers, all shackled in heavy chains, were led to the center and put on display. The air was filled with excited whispers and curious glances. Brunhilde looked around, fuming. She had never been so humiliated. As Blake emerged from the castle with her guards, Brunhilde seethed with rage. "What is the meaning of this, Blake?" she shouted, struggling against her bonds. "Why have I been arrested? This is an outrage." Blake stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with anger. "First of all, you will address me as queen. And as for your charges? Nothing short of treason. Brunhilde. You betrayed our kingdom and plotted to assassinate me. Treason? That's absurd." Brunhilde spat back. "Where is your proof, queen?" "Proof?" Blake's voice turned sharp. "I don't need proof. I am the primary witness. Besides me, there was another witness, and that is more than enough. You tried to have me killed. Your own henchman confessed to working for you." Brunhilde laughed derisively. "You're lying, Blake. Everyone here knows you're lying. You're a weak queen trying to defend your position by..." Blake raised her hand, her voice thundering across the square. "Silence. How dare you accuse me of lying? Me, the queen? Your arrogance disgusts me. You are nothing but a scheming, deceitful traitor." The crowd held its breath as the young queen demonstrated her authority with such fury. Then she confidently declared, "Brunhilde and her accomplices have secretly conspired, allied with the kingdom of Telania, and plotted against me. They sought to remove me to start a war against the goblins. I lack the words to adequately describe the gravity of this act." Clearing her throat, she continued, "Brunhilde employs a private army of criminal mercenaries for this purpose. I wouldn't be surprised if she had used her position to commit other murders and crimes before." Brunhilde screamed, "You have no evidence for such accusations." Blake merely shrugged. "That's true. All suspicions. But attempted regicide alone warrants the death penalty. The traitors will be executed immediately for their crimes." Confusion spread through the crowd. No executioners were in sight, only the queen's bodyguards stood ready. Suddenly, the ground shook repeatedly, and people saw the gigantic goblin woman, who had been waiting in the castle courtyard, rise and peer over the walls. A murmur ran through the crowd as Floni stepped over the wall and approached the marketplace. With each step Floni took, the ground trembled beneath her feet. The people drew back, some screaming in fear. Blake raised her hand to calm the crowd. "Do not be afraid. This is Floni, she announced loudly. She is my new general and will carry out the sentence. It is only fitting that Brunhilde and her henchmen, who harbor such hatred for goblins, should ultimately be crushed underfoot by a giant goblin woman, isn't it? Floni stepped forward, her colossal form casting a shadow over the square. She positioned herself, ready to act on Blake's command. Brunhilde, feeling the ground tremble beneath her, screamed in desperation. You can't have me crushed by a goblin giantess. Me under her disgusting feet? This is barbaric. Blake looked at Brunhilde coldly. There is no turning back, Brunhilde. You sealed your own fate. Floni stood still, her mighty feet directly in front of the bound traitors. The crowd was in absolute tension, waiting for what was to come. Blake stood on the platform and gave the signal. The first of Brunhilde's bound henchmen screamed desperately for mercy as Floni's enormous foot rose above him. With an elegant yet unstoppable motion, she lowered her foot. The man was slowly pressed down and finally disappeared, screaming, beneath the gigantic soul. The sound was horrible, a crunching crack and a muffled groan that abruptly stopped. The crowd flinched, some turning away, others staring. Transfixed at the gruesome spectacle, Floni lifted her foot again, and the crowd was horrified at the sight of the completely crushed body in the giantess's footprint, especially since some squishy parts still clung to her sole and only fell off after some time. It was macabre. The next traitor trembled with fear. Please, spare me, he cried, weeping as he saw the foot of the giant goblin woman coming over him, but Floni did not hesitate. With the same graceful movement as before, she stepped on him, crushing him under her massive sole. Again, the terrible crunching sounded, and the crowd murmured in shock. Brunhilde, who had to watch everything, turned pale. You can't do this, Blake. This is barbaric, she screamed, her eyes wide with horror. Blake replied coldly, you deserve this punishment, Brunhilde. And, actually, this is too good for you, because look, Floni has beautiful feet. I should have thought of a worse punishment for you, but oh well, it's too late. Consider this a last mercy. As they spoke, one after another was crushed by Floni. The crowd reacted differently. Some cheered and were thrilled by the giantess. Others looked shocked. But no one dared to oppose the queen's decision. Finally, only Brunhilde was left, now trembling and sinking to the ground. Blake stepped forward and stood before Brunhilde. I am deeply disappointed in you, Brunhilde. You were one of my closest advisors, and I trusted you. That you could plan something so evil is unforgivable. But now your end has come. Brunhilde glared at Blake. Go to hell, Blake. You are weak and naive. Your trust will destroy you. Soon, your reign will be over. You'll see. Were those your last words? Blake asked, disgusted, and nodded to Floni. Slowly, the giant goblin woman's foot rose as Brunhilde desperately tried to free herself. You will pay for this, she screamed one last time before Floni's foot loomed menacingly over her. Blake watched everything from close by. She felt a mixture of satisfaction and deep fascination as Floni slowly and with impressive grace lowered her foot. She saw Brunhilde fight for her life, but she had no chance. She was slowly pressed to the ground beneath the beautiful and mighty soul. The skin ridges of the soul enveloped her body, and she disappeared beneath the greenish skin. Then the giantess's toes set down directly in front of Queen Blake. The gruesome crunching filled the air, and Brunhilde's screams fell silent for good. Floni twisted her foot slightly back and forth to thoroughly grind Brunhilde to pulp. Blake could see the playful way Floni moved her foot, and she was overwhelmed by the power and beauty of the giant goblin woman. It was strangely fascinating to watch, and she discovered curious feelings within herself. Was she jealous of Brunhilde? She almost wanted to be under Floni's beautiful soul herself, though, of course, she didn't want to die. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Blake stood and gazed at Floni. The goblin woman looked at her and smiled slightly. Is everything all right, little queen? She asked gently. Blake nodded and took a deep breath. Yes, Floni. Everything is all right. Thank you for your help. Floni turned around and sat on the castle courtyard wall to relax a bit, tilting her head as she looked down at the little queen at her feet. Never thought I'd say this, but I'll always be by your side, Blake. I mean, Queen Blake. You can count on me. Blake felt a deep satisfaction and a growing admiration for Floni. She looked at the giant bloodstained soles before her and didn't find them repulsive. Not at all. Floni's feet looked enormous and powerful, yet somehow cute. She liked being at the feet of this giantess. Blake noticed some of her servants already cleaning up the remains of the crushed traitors and tidying the square. Others came to wash Floni's feet, the new supreme general. At that moment, Blake had an idea. You know what? I'm really glad we met. And I'm grateful that you accepted my friendship. Now, I'd like to show you my gratitude in my own way. Floni wondered what Blake meant. But when she saw the little queen along with her servants approaching her feet, she flinched. Hey, what are you doing? Blake looked up at her and smiled reassuringly. We want to clean your soles. After all, your feet got dirty because of my command. Floni was initially embarrassed. But that's not necessary. You don't have to do this, especially you, Blake. You're the queen. Blake shook her head. No, I really want to do this. Please, don't treat me any differently than yesterday, okay? Hesitantly, Floni lowered her feet a little so that the small people could easily touch her soles. Immediately, Blake and her servants began cleaning the giant soles. Blake took a soft cloth and dipped it in a bucket of warm water. Carefully, she wiped over Floni's skin, removing blood and dirt. The texture of the skin under her hands felt amazing, rough and yet soft at the same time. The many ridges and grooves in the skin were like large, beautiful lamellae from her perspective. With her hand and the cloth, she moved through the lines, cleaning as best as she could. Floni closed her eyes and gradually relaxed. At first, she was nervous and felt uncomfortable, but the gentle movements of the servants and Blake's careful touches helped her calm down. She even began to enjoy the feeling. It was a mix of relief and affection that flowed through her. Some of the servants were initially astonished and perhaps even a bit unsettled to see their queen doing such menial work. An older servant came beside her and remarked quietly, "But my queen, why are you doing this? What if people see this? Think of the etiquette." But Blake shook her head. "I don't care about etiquette. Floni saved my life, and I owe her a debt. Besides, I refuse to let my life be dictated by etiquette and traditions." He was surprised but said nothing more. As the other servants saw Blake's determination and affection for Floni, their attitudes began to shift. They admired their queen even more for her humility and willingness to get her hands dirty. It was a sign of true leadership. Some of the common folk who had witnessed the scene murmured among themselves. A few could scarcely believe their eyes. The queen herself is cleaning the huge feet of a goblin giantess? This is incredible, whispered one woman. But an older man beside her nodded wisely. This just shows how fortunate we are to have such a good queen. She demonstrates both generosity and humility. Rulers like this are rare. Blake noticed the conversations around her but remained undistracted. She focused on making Floni feel valued and accepted. "How does it feel, Floni?" she asked gently from below her foot as she cleaned a particularly dirty spot on the huge sole. Floni opened her eyes and smiled, her enormous teeth gleaming in the morning sun. It feels really good. Thank you and your people. This means a lot to me." Blake nodded and watched as her servants worked with equal care and attentiveness. It was a moment of unity and collaboration. "You are now part of our community, Floni. Not only a citizen of this kingdom, but you also have power and a lot of men under your command. And we're glad to have you with us." This time Floni was overwhelmed with feelings. She couldn't answer to all this praise she got. This was completely new to her. So she just sat there and watched all the tiny people around her big green feet. Blake was actually having a lot of fun. She felt close to Floni and was simply enchanted by the intricate details of her wonderful soul. Every time she cleaned a spot, she pressed her face against the gigantic sole or gave it a kiss. It must have looked odd, but she couldn't help herself. The skin pattern of the sole was far too beautiful to resist. The cleaning took some time, and when they were done, the atmosphere felt changed. It was as if an invisible bond had been woven between all present. Floni stood up slowly and carefully to not crush anyone underfoot. Her feet now were clean and free of any grime. Blake stepped back and admired the work. Consider this your initiation ceremony for becoming the new Supreme General. A giant Supreme General, if I may say so. Floni laughed and nodded. Thank you. That was truly relaxing and wonderful. And I'll do my best to make sure I don't disappoint you. The crowd began to applaud, impressed by Floni's size and their queen's humility. There were even some goblins in the crowd who were extremely happy when they saw their fellow goblin as a huge giantess and how she was served and admired by humans. It was all like a miracle to them and gave them hope for the future. Blake knew this was only the beginning. With Floni by her side, leading the kingdom into a new era of justice and peace would be much easier. The end. That was the story Floni Rises, a chapter from the series The Legend of Blake. We hope you liked the story. If so, please give us a thumbs up and leave a comment. We are always happy about that, and if you would like to support our work, take a look at our Patreon page. Thank you very much.